The moment Edna Hawkins pressed the barrel of her Winchester rifle against the cheek of the man who tried to steal her horse, she knew she had long since stopped being the kind of woman that polite society approved of, and she had made her peace with that somewhere between burying her father in the red dirt of West Texas and learning to tan her own hides in the punishing summer heat. That had been 3 years ago, in the autumn of 1879, when the world had still felt like something she might bend to her will. Now it was the spring of 1882, and Edna stood in the dusty main street of a town called Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, with a stolen horse returned to its post and a reputation that walked ahead of her like a long shadow at noon. She was 26 years old, lean and brown from the sun, with dark hair she kept pinned back with a bone clasp her mother had carved before she died. Her hands were calloused. Her eyes were the color of creek water after a storm, gray shot through with green, and they had a way of looking at people that made men straighten their spines without knowing why they did it. Harrow Creek was a town that smelled of horse manure and sawdust, and the acrid tang of the copper mine that ran 3 miles north of the main street. It was not a beautiful place. It was the kind of place that people arrived at and told themselves they would leave when the money was better, and then found themselves still there 10 years later, squinting at the same horizon. A general store, a livery stable, a land office, a saloon called the Broken Compass, a small church at the far end of the street that the pastor only visited twice a month, and a scattered collection of homes and claims that pushed out into the surrounding scrubland like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Edna had come to Harrow Creek because the Callaway Ranch, 2 miles east of town, had posted a notice in 3 different county papers looking for someone who could manage their livestock and coordinate the seasonal cattle drives south toward the railhead at Socorro. She had seen the notice tacked to a post in Las Cruces, and she had ridden 2 days north to answer it. She had not told them she was a woman in her written reply. She had signed it E. Hawkins and let the ambiguity do its work. The ranch foreman, a florid, thick-necked man named Orrin Calloway, who was both the owner and his own foreman because he trusted no one else with the title, had looked at her for a very long time when she arrived at his front porch. His wife, Margaret, had appeared in the doorway behind him with the expression of a woman who had seen many things come and go and had learned to hold her opinions until they were useful. "You are not what I pictured," Orrin had said. "You pictured wrong," Edna replied, and she had told him her credentials without softening them. She had worked 2 seasons on the good night-loving trail with her father before he died. She had managed a small herd of her own for a year after his death before selling them to settle his debts. She could rope, brand, shoot, read the weather in the shape of a cloud, and she had a gift for horses that some people called instinct and other people called something closer to magic, though she herself called it simply patience. Orrin had hired her, not because he was a progressive man. He was not. He had hired her because 3 other applicants had come and gone in 2 months, and spring roundup was bearing down on him like a freight wagon with no brake, and Edna Hawkins had looked him directly in the eye without flinching and told him she would not fail him. She had not. In the 3 weeks she had been at Callaway Ranch, she had reorganized the calving records, fixed a water trough system that had been leaking for 2 seasons, and earned the cautious but genuine respect of the 4 cowboys who worked the range. 2 of them, a young Mexican man named Tomas Reyes and a quiet, older black cowboy named Samuel Price, had been outright kind to her from the start. The other 2, brothers named Clint and Dale Marsh, had required more time, but even they had come around when they saw her handle a spooked stallion in the southeast pasture without raising her voice or her hands. It was Tomas who had first mentioned the name Jeremiah Fairchild. They had been mending fence along the north border of the Callaway property, Edna driving posts while Tomas stretched wire, and the conversation had wandered the way conversations do when hands are busy and the sun is mild, and there is nothing particular pressing at the moment. "The man who had your job before," Tomas said, not as a statement with judgment, simply as information. was a fellow named Darnell. He left because he had an argument with a man called Fairchild. Edna drove another post, felt the satisfying resistance of solid earth. What kind of argument? The kind that is mostly about water rights and ends with someone drawing a gun, Tomas said. He paused to loop wire around the post Edna had just set. Fairchild runs the property to the north of this one, a spread called the Rattlesnake Flats Ranch. Not because of the snakes, though there are plenty. He named it himself, and I think he has a sense of humor about what the territory thinks of him. And what does the territory think of him? Tomas considered this the way he considered most things, carefully, weighing the words before letting them loose. Some people think he is dangerous. Some people think he is fair. I think he is a man who is very certain about what belongs to him and very uncertain about what to do when something good happens to him that he did not plan for. Edna had filed the information away and thought nothing more of it for another week. Then the water rights argument arrived at her own doorstep. The Calloway Ranch and Rattlesnake Flats both had access to a seasonal creek called Redtail Creek, which ran along a shared border in the dry months when it ran at all, and which swelled considerably in the spring snowmelt. Orrin Calloway had a verbal agreement with the previous owner of Rattlesnake Flats, a man who had sold the property 2 years ago, regarding how the creek water would be divided during the dry season. That verbal agreement had never been committed to paper, and Jeremiah Fairchild, who had purchased Rattlesnake Flats 18 months ago, had not been party to it. When spring came, and the creek ran full and beautiful and absolutely essential, the question of whose cattle would drink from which section of bank became the kind of question that could turn neighbors into enemies before the summer was out. Orrin asked Edna to ride out and negotiate with Fairchild because, as he put it in his blunt and ungracious way, you have a way of talking that does not make men want to shoot you immediately. Or if it does, you can shoot back. He had meant it as a compliment, more or less. Edna had taken it as one. She rode out on a clear May morning on her own mare, a sturdy bay she called Harriet, following Tomas's directions toward the northern fence line. The land was beautiful in the way that the New Mexico territory was often beautiful, that violent, excessive beauty that had nothing gentle about it. Red rock formations erupting from sandy ground. Juniper and pinon pine clutching at the hillsides. The sky an absolute, uncompromising blue that made you feel simultaneously small and strangely glad to be alive. She found the border fence and the gate that marked the crossing point between properties. A sign had been nailed to the gate post. It read simply, Rattlesnake Flats, and below it in smaller letters in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, if you are lost, turn around. If you have business, knock. There was no door to knock on. Edna appreciated the dry humor of it. She opened the gate, rode through, and followed the track north for another half-mile until she heard the sound of water and beneath it, the low conversation of men at work. She came over a rise and saw them. 3 men were working along the bank of Redtail Creek, which was indeed running beautifully, clear and urgent, singing over smooth stones. 2 of the men were older, weathered ranch hands with the permanent squint of men who spent their days reading the distance. The 3rd man was different. He was tall, with the particular leanness of a man who worked hard and ate enough, but never too much. He wore a dark hat that had been through weather enough times to have acquired a character of its own, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms that were brown and roped with muscle. He was directing the placement of a wooden diversion channel, gesturing and explaining something to the 2 hands, and when he turned at the sound of Harriet's hooves, Edna got her first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a year or 2 older. His jaw was strong and set in a way that suggested stubbornness, but his eyes, dark brown and quick and intelligent, carried something that softened the stubbornness into something more like determination. He had a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, from something that had happened before she could guess at. His expression when he saw her passed through several stages rapidly: surprise, reassessment, a flicker of something she could not name, and then the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to take things in before reacting. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and even, with the faint elongation of vowels that placed his origins somewhere in the border states. Kentucky, she would guess later, and she would be right. "Edna Hawkins," she said, without returning the social softening. "I manage the Calloway Ranch. I am here about the creek." Something shifted in his expression. Not displeasure precisely, but the settling of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had been deciding how he wanted to have it. "Jeremiah Fairchild," he said. "Step down if you like." She did, because sitting on a horse while negotiating was a power play she generally found counterproductive. She tied Harriet to a juniper branch and walked to the bank, looking at what they were building. "That diversion channel," she said, "if it runs the direction you are pointing it, it is going to pull water away from the southern bank. It is going to run a branch line to my upper pasture," he said. "My cattle need water too. Orrin Calloway had an agreement with the man who sold you this property. Water divides at the old stone marker, halfway between both banks, equal access on both sides." "I know about that agreement," Fairchild said. "I also know it was never written down, and the man who made it never told me about it before selling me this land, and I discovered it only when Darnell came riding over here last fall with the same speech you just gave me." He paused. "And I know that Darnell left shortly after, which means the conversation did not end well for anyone." Edna looked at him directly. "What ended badly about it?" "He pulled a gun," Fairchild said, simply and without drama. "I did not pull mine. He eventually put his away, but neither of us felt much like talking after that." "I do not intend to pull a gun," Edna said. "I intend to work out something fair. But fair means both sides get what they need, not one side building a diversion channel before the conversation has happened." There was a silence. One of the ranch hands had the grace to study his boots. The other one watched the exchange with the transparent interest of a man who would have a great deal to say about it later in the bunkhouse. Jeremiah Fairchild looked at her for a moment, and she had the distinct sensation of being truly seen, not in the way that men often looked at women, cataloging and assessing, but something more like recognition, as if he were registering something he had not expected and was not entirely certain what to do with. "All right," he said. "Come and have coffee. We will talk about it properly." The ranch house at Rattlesnake Flats was a working house, not a grand one. It was solid adobe and timber, low to the ground in the sensible way of buildings that needed to withstand wind, with a long covered porch and a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular dry smell of rope and leather that clung to all working places in the territory. A woman named Dolers, who was perhaps 50 and who clearly ran the household with the quiet efficiency of a person who had no time for nonsense, produced 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and then disappeared, having assessed Edna with the swift accuracy of someone long practiced in reading the people who came through that door. Jeremiah and Edna sat at a plank table on the porch and talked about water for the better part of 2 hours. He was, she discovered, a more precise thinker than she had initially given him credit for. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers before speaking his own. He had purchased Rattlesnake Flats with a modest inheritance and 3 years of his own savings, and he had been working it for 18 months, and it was going well, but it was not yet secure, and the upper pasture water was not a luxury but a genuine necessity for his cattle during the dry months. She understood that. She also made clear that the Calloway cattle had the same necessity, and that the creek, in the dry months, did not produce enough water for both herds without a managed division. They arrived, by the end of the 2 hours, at a written agreement, drafted in Edna's careful hand on paper she found in a desk Fairchild offered her use of. The creek would divide at the old stone marker. During the dry months, each property would have access on alternating weeks, with the right of emergency access if livestock were genuinely in danger. The diversion channel would be repositioned to run parallel to the dividing line rather than drawing from the southern bank. Fairchild read the document twice before signing it, which she respected. Then he signed it and she signed it, and they each kept a copy. "You are good at this," he said when it was done. He was not being flattering, he was stating an observation. "I have had to be," she said. "How did you end up managing a cattle operation?" she told him briefly without self-pity. Her father, the good night-loving trail, the debts, the determination to make something from what remained. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "My father was a horse trader who lost everything he had to a poker game when I was 14. I have been working my own way since then." It was not a confession of weakness. It was a matching, an offering. She recognized it for what it was, even if she did not know quite what to do with it yet. She rode back to Callaway Ranch with the signed agreement in her saddlebag and a feeling she could not entirely account for, something unsettled in the best possible way, like ground that has just been turned and is ready for something new. Orrin Callaway was satisfied with the agreement. He studied it, grunted, and said, "Good. That is handled," which was as close to praise as Orrin generally managed. The weeks that followed were full of the hard, beautiful work of a ranch in spring. Roundup required everyone, and Edna worked alongside the 4 cowboys from before dawn to well past sunset, counting calves, checking brands, making decisions about which animals to drive south to the railhead and which to keep for breeding. She developed a particular shorthand with Samuel Price, who was the most experienced cowboy on the Callaway payroll and who had worked cattle drives for 30 years, and had a knowledge of cattle behavior that was encyclopedic and almost uncanny. He was a quiet man, but when he spoke, it was worth listening to, and Edna listened. Tomas managed the horses and was unfailingly cheerful and useful. The Marsh brothers settled into a working relationship with her that was professional if not warm. Through this period, she saw Jeremiah Fairchild twice in town. The first time was at the general store, where they acknowledged each other with a nod and exchanged a few words about the creek levels, which had already begun to recede slightly as the snowmelt tapered off. The second time was at the Broken Compass, where she had gone on a Saturday evening because she wanted a glass of whiskey and the solitude of being surrounded by strangers who were not her responsibility. And he was there at the bar with one of his ranch hands, and he had bought her a drink without making a production of it, simply setting a glass in front of her and saying, "For the water agreement." And she had accepted it, and they had talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with water or cattle. He had been to Louisville, she had been to San Antonio. They had both read their way through every book they could find in the places they had lived, and they shared the opinion that good books were as scarce as good rainfall in the territory and twice as necessary. He had 3 books at the ranch house that he had carried from Kentucky and read so many times the covers were soft. She had 2 that she had wrapped in oilcloth and kept in her saddlebag like something sacred. When she walked back to the Callaway bunkhouse that night, alone under a sky so packed with stars it seemed almost excessive, she thought about the shape of his hands around his whiskey glass and told herself that was a foolish thing to think about. She thought about it again the next morning while she was checking water levels at the South Trough, and she told herself the same thing, with somewhat less conviction. The trouble came in June, as trouble in the territory often did with the heat. A man named Virgil Crane ran a small competing cattle operation out of a leased property on the other side of Harrow Creek, and had a long-standing grievance against the Callaway Ranch, stemming from a property line dispute that predated Edna's arrival, and that Orrin Callaway explained to her in fragmented, angry pieces over the course of several conversations. The dispute was old and complicated and probably had validity on both sides, but Crane was the kind of man who nursed grievances the way other men nursed injuries, with constant attention and no intention of letting them heal. Crane had also, Edna learned from Samuel Price, who had a way of knowing most of what was happening in any 20-mile radius, been making moves to redirect water from Redtail Creek upstream before it reached either the Callaway or the Fairchild properties. He had no legal right to do this. He had also, apparently, not let the absence of legal rights stop him from making the attempt. It was Tomas who rode out to check the creek levels on the first hot week of June and came back with the news that the water flow had dropped sharply and that there was evidence upstream of someone having attempted to dam the creek at its narrowest point. Edna rode out to see for herself. She found the partial dam, built from stones and packed earth, clearly recent. The flow was not entirely stopped, but it was reduced by perhaps a third, which in a dry summer would become a serious problem for both the Calloway and the Fairchild herds. She rode upstream another mile and a half and found where the work had been done more extensively. There was also a man still working, a laborer Edna did not recognize, who took one look at her and the rifle across her saddle and began walking away with the careful nonchalance of someone who has decided that the money is not quite good enough. She dismantled what she could of the upper work herself, breaking up the packed earth dam with a long stick in her hands, redirecting the water back into its natural channel. It took 2 hours and left her soaked to the knee and covered in clay. When she rode back toward Calloway territory, she found Jeremiah Fairchild coming from his side of the border at a canter, his expression somewhere between furious and controlled. He reined in when he saw her. "I saw the water drop," he said. "I know," she said. "Crane, the dam is mostly broken now. We need to put something in writing with the county land office about rights to this creek from source to border, or he will try again." Fairchild looked at her for a moment, and something in his face did something she could not quite interpret, but that felt like admiration and something more personal, something that had a warmth to it that was not simply neighborly appreciation. "You went up there yourself," he said. "Someone had to. You are covered in creek mud. I am aware." He swung down from his horse and stood beside her at the bank, looking at the water flowing again, clean and purposeful. "Thank you," he said, and then in a different register entirely, quieter and with a carefulness that made her pay attention to it. "I have been trying to find a reason to ride over to Calloway property that would not look like I was manufacturing excuses." The honesty of it was so unadorned that it stopped her for a moment. "You did not need an excuse," she said, eventually. "You could have come to discuss the channel repositioning. The channel was repositioned 3 weeks ago. Then you could have come to discuss how the repositioning was working." The corner of his mouth shifted. It was not a full smile yet, but it was something moving in that direction. "And how is it working, in your professional opinion?" "Exceptionally well," she said. "The channel is directing water exactly where it should go." "Good," he said. And then, after another of those pauses that had started to feel to her less like silence and more like a language all its own, "Would you have supper at Rattlesnake Flats on Saturday? Dollar's makes a ham that would make you forgive the territory for the summer heat." She looked at the water moving past their feet. She looked at his hands, which were at his sides, open and still. She thought about what she always thought about, which was whether she was the kind of woman who was entitled to something that felt this uncertain and this good simultaneously. "Yes," she said, "I will come Saturday." The ride back to Calloway Ranch felt different than the ride out. She could not have said exactly how, only that the sky seemed to sit at a slightly different angle than it had before. Saturday came with the heavy, golden light that the New Mexico territory produced in June evenings, that long, slow burning of the day that made everything look like a painting of itself. Edna changed into the better of her 2 dresses, a dark blue that her friend Clara in Las Cruces had helped her buy for the occasion of nothing in particular, which made it available now for the occasion of something specific. She unpinned her hair, brushed it, and pinned it again more carefully than usual, which she noted with some internal amusement was the most she had done with her appearance in several months. She rode to Rattlesnake Flats as the sun was beginning its long descent. Jeremiah met her at the porch in a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing up, and there was a moment when they stood looking at each other with the slightly awkward grace of people who are not entirely certain what register this evening is in, whether it is a business supper between neighbors or something they do not yet have words for. Dollar's had made ham and cornbread and a sweet potato dish, and a pie that was the color of autumn and smelled of cinnamon and dried apples. She served the food, and then retired to the kitchen with the dignity of a woman who was giving them privacy without making a point of it. They ate on the porch in the cooling evening, with the first stars beginning to appear in the east and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night and the creek audible if they were quiet, which they were not, because they talked all the way through supper and into the evening after. He had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky, the eldest of 3 children. His mother had been a school teacher and had taught him to value books and to take things seriously without being solemn about them. His father's gambling loss had scattered the family, and his mother had eventually remarried a steady, kind man in Louisville, and Jeremiah had gone west at 22 because the East felt too small and too full of the shape of things he had not been able to keep. She told him about her own childhood, which had been largely outdoors, following her father's restless wandering from ranch to ranch across West Texas. Her mother had died of fever when Edna was 11, and after that it had been just the two of them, her father and herself, and she had learned that she was made for this kind of life, the open land, the work, the self-sufficiency that had no glamour to it but had a deep and genuine satisfaction that she would not have traded. "Do you miss gentleness?" he asked. It was not a loaded question. He was asking something specific and simple. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, leaning forward slightly with his elbows on the table and his eyes on her with that quality of real attention that she had come to recognize as one of his most constant features, that the life you are describing, and the life you are clearly built for, it is not a gentle life, and I wonder if you ever feel the absence of the other kind. She was quiet for a moment. The stars had multiplied considerably while they were talking. There was a coyote somewhere in the middle distance, its call floating over the scrubland with that distinctive, wild loneliness. "I am not gentle," she said. She said it directly and without apology, the way she said most things. "I have not been gentle for a long time, and I am not certain I ever was. I am practical and I am capable and I am sometimes kind, but I am not a gentle woman, and any man who wanted that from me would be disappointed." Jeremiah looked at her without the surprise she had half expected, and without the particular male retreat that sometimes followed her directness, that slight drawing back that was almost invisible but that she had learned to see. Instead he said, "The frontier does not need gentle, it needs you." The words landed somewhere unexpected. Not on her surface, where she would have deflected them with a dry remark, but somewhere interior, in a place she had kept carefully boarded shut for some time. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and she could see that he had meant exactly what he said, not as a flattery and not as a romantic speech learned from some novel, but as a true statement that he had arrived at himself and was simply reporting. "That is an unusual thing to say," she said. "You are an unusual woman," he said. "I mean that as the most accurate compliment I know how to give." The evening moved from supper into the kind of conversation that does not want to end, that finds reasons to continue. Another cup of coffee, another question, a story that leads to another story. It was past 10 o'clock when Edna finally stood to go, and the propriety of the hour and the distance she had to ride home were the only things that moved her. He walked her to where Harriet was tethered, and they stood in the warm dark, and he said, "I would like to see you again. Not about the creek." "Not about the creek," she agreed. He helped her mount, an offer she would normally have declined, but she accepted it from him, and his hand was brief and careful at her arm, and then she was riding home through the starlit scrubland with something warm and complicated settled in her chest. The Virgil Crane situation came to its head at the end of June. Crane, apparently emboldened by the absence of consequences for his previous attempt, tried the creek dam again, this time with more men and more materials, and he had also sent a letter to the Harrow Creek Land Office contesting the boundaries of Redtail Creek's flow as it related to his leased property. The letter was legally creative in its interpretations, and almost certainly the work of an attorney who charged by the word. Edna went to the land office herself, with the water rights agreement she and Jeremiah had signed in May, and with a survey map she had been carefully updating for the past several weeks with measurements she had taken herself of the creek's course and the property boundaries. She presented these to the land agent, a methodical German-American named Heinrich Baer, who had been in Harrow Creek for 15 years, and who took the business of the land office with a seriousness that was almost holy. Baer studied her documents and Cranes let her side by side for a long time. Then he said, "Your survey measurements are more current than the ones in our office file." "I took them last week," Edna said. "The old file map is 11 years old and the creek has moved its bed in the northeast section." Baer looked at her over his spectacles. "You surveyed this yourself." "I have the instruments and the knowledge to do so." This was true. Her father had taught her basic surveying, which had been part of the work of establishing property lines on the ranches he managed. Baer accepted the updated measurements and registered the water rights agreement properly in the county record, which gave it the legal weight that its previous informal status had lacked. Crane's letter was filed, reviewed, and ultimately denied on the grounds that his leased property did not include creek access rights under the original lease terms, a fact that Baer confirmed by pulling the lease document itself from the files and reading it aloud to Crane's attorney with the measured relish of a man who has found the exact right page. The creek dam attempt stopped. Crane retreated into a sullen distance, and the summer moved forward. Jeremiah had come to the land office meeting. She had not asked him to, but he had shown up, because his name was also on the water rights document, and because she was beginning to understand, a quality of showing up that was as natural to him as breathing. Not intrusively. He did not take over. He sat beside her and answered questions when they were directed at him, and let her conduct the presentation because it was clearly her work and clearly done well. Afterward, on the steps of the land office, he said, "You did not need me here." "No," she said, "I came anyway. I noticed." They rode to the Broken Compass and had lunch together, which caused some talk in Harrow Creek, because the territory was a place where people observed closely and discussed enthusiastically, and drew conclusions with great speed, and not always great accuracy. Mrs. Adelaide Price, who ran the town's small rooming house and served as its unofficial social recorder, told 3 different people that afternoon that she had seen the woman from Calloway Ranch and the man from Rattlesnake Flats having lunch together in a manner that was clearly more than neighborly. And by evening, it had made its way around the town with the efficiency of a thing that people found interesting. Neither Edna nor Jeremiah was greatly troubled by this. They were both old enough and independent enough to be past the age of caring intensely about what the town made of their company. The summer was long and hot and full of work. The cattle drive to the Socorro railhead happened in July, and Edna rode at the front of it with Samuel Price and the Marsh brothers and Tomas, moving 400 head of Callaway cattle south over 3 days through the heat and the dust, and the particular combination of tedium and vigilance that made a cattle drive both exhausting and, in its way, magnificent. She had always loved the drive, the size of it, the sound of it, the way the horizon kept changing as you moved toward it. At the railhead, she negotiated the selling price with a cattle agent who had expected to find Orrin Calloway and instead found Edna Hawkins, and who had tried twice to assume that she was present in some secondary capacity before she laid the herd records on his desk and began to discuss price per head with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for years. They arrived at a price that was $1.50 per head above the agent's opening offer, which Orrin Calloway was very pleased about when they returned. Jeremiah had taken his own smaller herd to market independently, but the timing had overlapped, and they found each other at the Railhead Hotel dining room the evening before heading back north, and they ate dinner together at a table by the window and looked out at the lights of Socorro and talked, and eventually Jeremiah said, quietly, in the middle of a conversation that had been ranging over several subjects, "I think I am in love with you." The restaurant was not a quiet place. There was a piano playing in the adjacent saloon, and the sound of men who had just sold cattle and were celebrating accordingly, and the clatter of dishes, and the smell of roasted meat. But in the small circle of their table it suddenly felt very still. Edna looked at him. He looked back with the honest, unguarded expression of a man who had said a true thing and was not going to pretend he had not. "That is a considerable claim," she said. "I know it is." She was quiet for a moment. The piano played something she did not recognize. Outside, a horse moved past the window and someone laughed and the world went on being itself. "I have been trying," she said carefully, "to find a reason that this would be inadvisable." "Have you found one?" "Not a strong one," she said. He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and it changed his whole face into something that made her chest feel insufficient for what it was trying to contain. "I have been thinking," she continued, "that I am not easy to love. I am not compliant. I am not soft. I have opinions and habits and a life that I have built entirely for myself, and I do not know how to make room in it without losing something important." "I am not asking you to lose anything," he said. "I am not a man who wants to own a woman. I have enough to manage without that." She laughed at that genuinely, and then she said, "I think I am in love with you too. I want you to know I have found it an inconvenient and somewhat alarming experience." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there in the noisy, warm room with their hands linked on the table, and the summer night outside was hot and full of stars. They rode back north the next morning, and the weeks after that were the same in their work, but different in everything else. He would ride over to Calloway on Sunday afternoons. She would ride to Rattlesnake Flats on Wednesday evenings. Dolores took all of this in with the expression of a woman who has been hoping for this specific development, and is exercising considerable restraint in not pointing that out. They sat on his porch in the long summer evenings and read to each other from the books they had. He read to her from a dog-eared copy of a Dickens novel, and she read to him from a book of natural history that she had found in a box of discarded goods at the general store, and which she found deeply satisfying, full of careful, specific information about the world. They argued sometimes about things, about the best approach to managing drought conditions, about whether a particular passage in the Dickens made sense, about the merits and failures of the territorial government's land policies, and the arguing was good, clean and engaged, and never unkind. She told him once in the middle of August, sitting on the bank of Redtail Creek in the hour before sunset, with the water low but present and the light coming in at a long, amber angle through the juniper branches, that she had not known what it was like to be understood before. "What do you mean?" he said. He was lying back on the bank with his hat over his eyes, but she knew he was listening. "I mean that people have always known what I could do," she said. "My father knew. The men I have worked with have come to know, but knowing what someone can do is not the same as knowing who they are." He pushed the hat up and looked at her. "Who are you?" he said. It was a genuine question. She thought about it. "I am someone who loves the land and is sometimes lonely in it. I am someone who was angry for a long time after my mother died and my father died, and I had to become entirely my own resource. I am someone who does not ask for help easily and who is learning that this is not always a strength." She paused. "I am someone who is sitting on a creek bank in August in the New Mexico territory telling a cowboy things I have not told anyone else, which I find surprising and also correct." Jeremiah sat up. "I find it correct too," he said. He touched her face with one hand, the gentlest gesture, and she let herself lean into it, which was itself a kind of courage that felt larger than anything she had done with a rifle. They kissed for the first time there on the bank of Redtail Creek, with the water moving past them and the evening cooling around them, and it was unhurried and real. And when they separated, she felt not the anxious need to protect herself from it, but something that felt remarkably like peace. The autumn brought its own complications. A family named Thatcher arrived in Harrow Creek in September, a husband and wife and their 3 children, and they had purchased the leased property that Virgil Crane had vacated when his operation failed entirely over the summer. The Thatchers were quiet, industrious people who wanted nothing more than to establish themselves properly, and they brought with them a slight energy of renewal that the town responded to positively. But the Thatchers' arrival also brought a property line question, because the sale of the property had been conducted through an intermediary in Santa Fe who had not communicated with Heinrich Bear at the land office, and there was a discrepancy in the recorded boundaries that left a 40-acre parcel technically unattributed. That parcel included a section of the creek bank, and because of this, it was immediately relevant to the water rights that Edna and Jeremiah had worked so carefully to establish. Edna sat down with Heinrich Bear and the Thatcher family together and talked through the survey records. William Thatcher, who was a large, quiet man with a serious face and a willingness to listen, had been a surveyor himself in Missouri before heading west, and he and Edna fell into the efficient shorthand of people who understand the same technical language. They established the proper boundary together, which placed the 40-acre parcel clearly within the Thatcher property, and which also, because Edna had surveyed the creek carefully, established that the Thatcher property's section of the creek bank was upstream of the point at which the Cowboy Fairchild water rights document applied. This was documented, filed, and signed by all relevant parties, and the water rights situation on Redtail Creek was at last fully resolved and legally secure. Martha Thatcher, William's wife, was a sharp, warm woman who had been watching the entire meeting with the alert eyes of someone filing information away, and afterward she said to Edna quietly, while their husbands discussed something else, "The man from Rattlesnake Flats. He has been watching you the whole meeting." Edna glanced over. Jeremiah was indeed looking at her, with the particular expression that she had come to know as the one he wore when he was very close to saying something significant. "He does that," she said. "Good," said Martha Thatcher, with a smile that contained several years of matrimonial wisdom. "A man who watches a woman like that is a man who sees her. That is rarer than people think." The fall roundup was smaller than the spring one but still required the full effort of everyone on the Callaway payroll. Samuel Price, who was 63 and had mentioned several times that he was considering retiring to his daughter's place in Texas, worked through it with the steady endurance of a man who has decided he will finish what he started before he goes. He was magnificent with the cattle as always, and at the end of the roundup, Edna shook his hand and told him that working alongside him had been one of the finest professional experiences of her life, and Samuel, who was not given to sentiment, said, "You are a good leader, Miss Hawkins. The land respects you," and she held that in her chest like a coal against the coming cold. October arrived with a clarity that the summer's heat made precious. The mornings were cold, and the afternoons warm, and the light had that particular crystalline quality of a high desert autumn. Edna's relationship with Jeremiah had settled into something that both of them recognized as serious and permanent, though neither had yet made the explicit statement that they both knew was approaching. It approached on a Sunday in October, when Jeremiah rode to Callaway Ranch in the middle of the afternoon rather than his usual Sunday timing, and found Edna in the corral working with a young colt that Orrin had acquired, and that had been difficult from the start. She was in the process of convincing the colt, through patient and precise work, that she was not a threat and that cooperation was in both of their interests. She was entirely absorbed in this, moving in small, deliberate steps, reading the animal's body language with a fluency that took years to develop, and she did not notice Jeremiah's arrival for several minutes. When she did, she registered his expression and knew that this was a different kind of visit. She left the colt in the corral and came to the fence. He was standing at the rail with his hat in his hands, and she had never seen him quite like this, not uncertain exactly, but more exposed in the way that honesty requires exposure. "I have been thinking," he said, "about asking you to marry me." The colt moved behind her. A breeze came through from the north. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica badly but with enthusiasm. "Have you come to a conclusion?" she said. "I have," he said. "I want to ask you, I am asking you." He paused. "But I want to do it right. I want to tell you what I am asking and what I am not asking so there is no confusion." "All right," she said. "I am asking you to be my wife and to build this life with me. I am not asking you to stop being who you are. I am not asking you to give up your work or your independence or your way of doing things. I know that you are capable of everything you do, and I love that. I am asking you to let me be beside you in it." He looked at her steadily. "I do not need you to be soft or compliant or anything other than exactly what you are. The frontier does not need gentle, it needs you. And so do I." She had heard that phrase before from his mouth that first evening on the Rattlesnake Flats porch. It had settled into her then. Now it landed with the full weight of a proposal behind it and something in her that had been waiting, not for the words themselves but for the proof that the words were true, finally let go of its caution. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He reached over the fence rail and took her hands, and she gripped his back, and they stood there on either side of the fence with their hands locked together, and the wide October sky above them. And both of them were smiling with the unguarded happiness of people who have arrived somewhere after a long journey and recognize it as the place they were always going toward. They were married in December, in the small church at the end of Harrow Creek's Main Street. On the first Sunday, the traveling pastor came to town that month. It was a cold, clear day with a hard blue sky and the smell of ice in the air. And the church was full to overflowing, because the town had by then taken considerable interest in this match, and had decided collectively that it approved. Dolers had made Edna a ribbon for her hair, cream-colored silk, that she pressed into Edna's hands the morning of the wedding, with the brisk efficiency of a woman doing something sentimental, and not wanting it remarked upon. Edna wore her dark blue dress and her mother's bone hair clasp alongside the ribbon, and she carried a small bunch of dried desert flowers that Martha Thatcher had put together from her own stores. Tomas Reyes, who had wept with transparent and beautiful sincerity at 3 separate weddings in his life, according to his own cheerful report, wept again. Samuel Price, who was present because Edna had written to him specifically, having learned the month before that he had indeed retired to Texas, had made the journey back for the occasion, which was a gift that she received with considerably more emotion than she generally permitted herself. Orrin Calloway shook Jeremiah's hand at the reception, which was held in the cleared back room of the Broken Compass, with Dolers cooking filling every available surface. Margaret Calloway embraced Edna with a warmth that surprised them both, and Margaret said, "I told Orrin when he hired you that he had made the best decision of his ranching life. I was right." Adelaide Price cried, though she would deny it later. Heinrich Bear offered a toast that was precise, warm, and formally excellent. Edna and Jeremiah danced, because the evening called for it, and the fiddler the saloon had brought in was very good. And she was not a practiced dancer, but she was a person of natural coordination, and he led well. And they danced in the cleared room with the lantern light warm around them, and the whole town watching with the affectionate investment of people who have been hoping for exactly this. They rode home to Rattlesnake Flats together under a sky so cold and clear that every star had a specific, particular character, and the horses moved through the dark with the sound of their hooves steady and calm on the frozen ground, and they did not talk much because there was nothing that required words at that moment. The new year, 1883, opened with a hard January that tested every operation in the territory. Snow came early and stayed, and the cattle required constant tending, and Edna and Jeremiah worked the combined operations of Rattlesnake Flats, and as Edna still traveled over regularly to manage the Calloway operation, the neighboring ranch as well. This dual arrangement, which some people in town found unconventional, worked because Edna was genuinely exceptional at managing multiple complex systems simultaneously, and because Jeremiah trusted her judgment implicitly, which was not nothing. Trust of that specific quality was, she had come to understand, the rarest thing in any relationship. Dolers, who had never had anyone to properly fuss over in the years she had managed the Rattlesnake Flats household alone, took to having Edna in the house with a focused and dignified delight. She left books on the kitchen table when she thought Edna might need them. She made the coffee stronger in the mornings when she could tell Edna was thinking hard about something. She occasionally, and with no fanfare at all, left wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. The spring of 1883 brought the announcement, made by Edna to Jeremiah on a morning in late March, when the last snow was melting off the high ground and Redtail Creek was beginning to run with the particular urgency of snowmelt, that she was expecting a child. He stood very still for a moment when she told him. She watched his face move through a sequence of emotions that she found, later when she thought about it, very characteristic of him. First, the registering of the fact itself. Then the processing of its implications, practical and emotional simultaneously. Then the arrival at a feeling that settled in his expression as something so transparent and genuine that she had to look away briefly because it was almost too much to look at directly. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was who he was. "I am well," she said. "I am also entirely practical about this. I will work as long as I can work, and I will need your help when I cannot, and I will need you to let me make the decisions about when that point arrives." "Of course," he said. He came to her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with that quality of complete attention. "Are you glad?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am," she said, and found as she said it that it was entirely true. "I did not expect to want this. I had assumed that the life I had made was sufficient, but this feels like something additional rather than something replacing anything." He pulled her into an embrace that was careful and strong, and she leaned into him, which she did more easily now than she ever had before, having spent a year discovering that leaning on something solid was not the same as losing your own footing. The pregnancy was, in keeping with Edna's general approach to life, handled with a great deal of practical management and minimal drama, while also including the discovery of feelings and physical states she had not anticipated. She continued to manage the Calloway operation through June, writing more carefully as the months progressed, delegating to Tomas, who had been given a supervisory role that he handled with growing confidence. She kept her own accounts and records current. She read everything she could find about the management of livestock in drought conditions, because the summer of 1883 was shaping up to be dry, and she wanted to be prepared. She also, in the evenings on the porch at Rattlesnake Flats, began to talk about things she had not talked about before. About her mother, whom she had loved deeply and whose loss had been the great wound of her early life. About the loneliness of the years after her father died, when she had been entirely alone and had made herself not need anything that she could not provide herself, and how that had been necessary and had also cost her something. Jeremiah listened, as he always did, with the complete and patient attention that was his greatest gift. And he told her his own things, about the years after his father's failure, about the shame that had lived in him for a long time about where he had come from, about the slow process of building something of his own that he was proud of, and that owed nothing to the past he had not chosen. They were, by the late summer of 1883, people who knew each other with the depth and specificity that only comes from time and honesty, and the willingness to remain present through all the versions of each other that emerge in the course of living together. He was not a perfect man. He was occasionally too stubborn, and sometimes he retreated into a silence that was not exactly closed to her, but that required patience to wait through. She was not a perfect woman. She was sometimes too quick to take charge when collaboration would have served better, and she had a pride about asking for help that she was still working to soften without losing the core of her self-sufficiency that she valued. They had learned to name these things. That was the work of a marriage, she understood, not the resolution of differences, but the commitment to navigating them with honesty and goodwill. Their son was born on a September morning in 1883, delivered by the doctor who served Harrow Creek and two of the surrounding towns, and who arrived with an hour to spare, in a calm professional manner that Edna found deeply reassuring. Jeremiah was present and held her hand, and was, by the account of the doctor who told the story several times afterward, the most uselessly devoted man he had encountered in a birthing room, which the doctor meant as a compliment. The boy was named William Thomas Fairchild, William for William Thatcher, who had become a genuine friend, and Thomas for Tomas Reyes, who upon hearing this piece of news sat down abruptly on a fence post and had to be brought a cup of water. William was a large, healthy child who from his earliest weeks displayed a quality of intense, interested alertness that his father recognized as his own and his mother recognized as hers, and which in combination promised an interesting childhood for everyone involved. The Calloway Ranch situation resolved itself in a way Edna had not anticipated in the fall of 1883, when Orrin Calloway, who was 61 and whose wife had been asking him for years to consider slowing down, made the unexpected decision to sell the property. He sold it not to a distant buyer, but to a consortium of three: Edna and Jeremiah themselves, and William Thatcher, who had the capital and the ambition to expand his operation. The arrangement was negotiated at the Calloway kitchen table over 3 evenings, with Margaret Calloway serving coffee and occasionally offering a clarifying observation that was invariably correct, and with Heinrich Baer present on the 3rd evening to review the legal documents. Orrin and Margaret retained a small house on the western edge of the property, where they intended to live in the managed retirement that Margaret had been engineering toward for the better part of a decade. The resulting enterprise was called the Redtail Creek Cooperative, an informal designation but one that reflected the reality of 3 neighboring operations managing their shared resources together. It was not a standard arrangement for the territory in 1883, and there were people in Harrow Creek who thought it impractical or peculiar, and there were people who watched it work and found it quietly impressive. Edna managed the combined record-keeping and the water resource management. Jeremiah took primary responsibility for the cattle drives and the market negotiations. William Thatcher managed the survey and land maintenance. Tomas, who had been elevated to head foreman of the old Calloway property with a corresponding increase in his wages, managed the day-to-day operation of that section with the unhurried competence he brought to everything. It was not an easy arrangement. There were disagreements, some of them sharp. There were seasons that punished them and seasons that rewarded them, and the rewards were never as large as they hoped, and the punishments were never quite as devastating as they feared, which was perhaps the truest description of frontier life that Edna ever arrived at. By the spring of 1885, little William was walking with the particular reckless confidence of an 18-month-old, who has not yet fully understood the relationship between speed and stability. And Edna was 4 months into another pregnancy that was, as before, being managed with practicality and considerable internal happiness. She had discovered that motherhood agreed with her in ways she had not expected, not the softening that people sometimes implied would happen. She was not softer, but a deepening, a new dimension of feeling that had been available to her all along and simply required this specific occasion to emerge. Jeremiah was with William constantly when he was not working, carrying the boy on his shoulders or setting him atop old Harriet for gentle, careful walks around the pasture, while Edna watched from the fence with the particular expression she wore when something exceeded her capacity to manage its effect on her. He read to William from the same dog-eared Dickens he had read to Edna, and from a new acquisition, a collection of nature writings, and the boy would sit with the focused solemnity of someone taking in important information, and then immediately go and try to eat a rock or investigate the underside of a trough. "He is magnificently fearless," Edna said once, watching William attempt to make friends with a chicken that had no interest in the friendship. "He gets it from his mother," Jeremiah said. "His father is not exactly cautious. His father is strategically cautious." He paused. "His mother is constitutionally brave. There is a difference." She looked at him. "Is that a compliment or a concern?" "Both," he said, "in the finest possible way." Their second child, a girl they named Clara Frances Fairchild, for Edna's friend in Las Cruces and for Jeremiah's mother Frances, was born in October of 1885 on a day when the aspens on the high ground had gone golden, and the air smelled of the changing season, and the first geese were moving south in their long, purposeful formations. Clara was, from the beginning, a different temperament than her brother, quieter and more observational, watching the world with a thoughtful intensity that made dolers say, "She has her mother's eyes and her father's patience," which Edna found remarkably accurate. She was a healthy, good-natured child who in the evenings would lie on the parlor rug and simply look at the ceiling with a contentment that seemed very settled and very wise for someone who had been alive for only a few weeks. The years moved as years do, with the accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary moments that together constituted a life. There was a drought in 1886 that tested the water management systems they had built to their limits, and those systems held, not easily, but they held, and the losses were manageable. There was a good year in 1887 that let them add a new barn to Rattlesnake Flats and repair the Calloway ranch house roof that had been developing a character of its own in the rainstorms. Samuel Price visited twice in those years, traveling up from Texas with the care of a man who was older but not diminished, and he would sit on the Rattlesnake Flats porch and drink dolers coffee and watch William and Clara tear around the yard and observe that the territory was looking well. Tomas Reyes, who was 32 by 1887 and had been promoted and trusted and paid accordingly, met a woman named Rosario during one of the cattle drives south, a widow with a small daughter who was sharp-minded and beautiful, and who, after considerable correspondence and 3 visits, agreed to come north to Harrow Creek and marry him. The wedding was held in the same small church where Edna and Jeremiah had been married, and this time it was Edna's turn to provide the ribbon and the dried flowers, which she did with the brisk, concealed sentiment that dolers had demonstrated for her, and that she had absorbed and made her own. The Thatcher family grew too, and Harrow Creek itself grew, as towns do in the territory when the land proves worth staying on. New buildings appeared. A proper schoolhouse was established in 1886, which meant that William, at 3, had educational infrastructure waiting for him. The school was staffed by a teacher from Ohio named Miss Evangeline Marsh, who had no relation to the Marsh brothers but who shared their determinedness, and who took to teaching in Harrow Creek with a missionary intensity that benefited the town considerably. Edna served on the school board because no one else was going to, and because the things she had learned from her own father, and from life, and from every book she had read had made her understand that education was the sharpest tool available to people who did not have the advantage of inherited wealth or social position. She was not the kind of board member who attended meetings and nodded. She was the kind who came with notes and questions and a list of things that needed to happen, and the school benefited from this. Jeremiah attended meetings when she needed him and stayed home with the children when she needed that, and he made neither arrangement feel like a sacrifice. This was, she had come to understand, not a small thing. It was, in fact, a very large thing. There was a night in the winter of 1888, when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet, and the wind was doing something theatrical outside, and dolers had retired to her rooms at the back of the house, and Edna and Jeremiah were sitting by the fire, she reading and he mending a bridle with the careful attention he gave to anything mechanical, and she looked at him across the fire-lit room and felt something so complete and steady and warm that it seemed almost too large for her chest to accommodate. He looked up and found her looking at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." She paused. "I was thinking about the day I rode to Rattlesnake Flats for the first time to argue about the creek." He set down the bridle. "I remember. I was covered in creek mud." "You were," he said, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did. "I thought you were the most extraordinary person I had ever seen." "I was filthy." "Yes, also extraordinary." He paused. "Both things can be true." She looked at him across the room with the fire between them and the wind outside and the sleeping children somewhere in the back of the house. And she thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in Harrow Creek, the woman who had been alone and capable and who had told herself that was sufficient and had believed it mostly. And she thought about what she had said to Jeremiah on that first real evening, when she had told him she was not gentle, and what he had said back. "You meant it," she said. "What you said that first night at your porch, about the frontier not needing gentle, about needing me." "I meant every word," he said. "I have meant it every day since." "I did not know what to do with it when you said it." "I know," he said. "You went a little still, the way you do when something surprises you. You noticed that." "I notice everything about you," he said simply and without theater. "I always have." She closed her book. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench near the fire, and he put his arm around her with the ease of long practice, and she leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, looking at the fire. "I have been happy," she said, in the tone of someone making an accurate report. "I want you to know that. I have been genuinely, thoroughly happy, which is something I am not certain I expected to be able to say." "I know," he said. "I have too." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I expect to be for a long time yet." Outside, the wind moved across the land, the way the wind had always moved across it, indifferent and magnificent. And the territory lay under the winter sky as it had always lain, vast and requiring and beautiful in its severity. And inside the house on Rattlesnake Flats, the fire burned steadily, and two people who had found each other in the middle of all that space sat together in the warmth they had built. In the spring of 1889, the New Mexico Territory was still working toward statehood, a process that would take another 2 decades of political maneuvering that Edna followed with interest, and some frustration in the newspapers that came to Harrow Creek twice a week by post. The territory's situation was complicated, as it had always been, by its demographics and its history, by the presence of Apache and Navajo peoples whose own claims and rights had been systematically ignored and violated by the same federal government that now presided over territorial administration. Edna had learned enough from the land and from the people she had met across it to understand that the story of the frontier that was told in the Eastern papers was not the whole story, and that the celebration of settlement omitted too much of what it had cost and whom it had cost it, and she held this understanding with the seriousness it deserved. She made sure that when William and Clara were old enough to understand, they were given the fuller account, not the triumphalist version but the honest one, the one that included the land's prior inhabitants and the injustice of their treatment, and that acknowledged that the land they lived on had a history before them that they were obliged to respect and know. Jeremiah supported this, as he supported most of Edna's convictions, because he shared them, having arrived at his own understanding through his own roots, and because he was, at his core, a man who believed that the truth was worth telling even when it was uncomfortable. By the summer of 1889, William was 5 and had begun his schooling with Miss Evangeline Marsh, and he approached it with the intensity of someone who has discovered that the world contains more information than he previously understood, and that he intends to have all of it. He could already read simple passages, which Edna attributed to 5 years of being read to by 2 adults who both found books indispensable, and he was learning to write in the careful block letters that Miss Marsh required of her pupils. Clara, at 3, would sit at the edge of the schoolroom door and watch when Edna brought William in the mornings, absolutely absorbed by the proceedings, and Miss Marsh had taken to setting her a small slate and chalk to occupy herself with, which Clara used with a seriousness that the teacher found charming, and that made Edna smile in the private way she reserved for things that genuinely delighted her. Tomas and Rosario had a baby of their own by then, a boy named Mateo, who was friends with Clara in the effortless way of very young children. Rosario's daughter from her first marriage, a girl named Isabel who was 7, and who had decided immediately that she adored William with the single-minded attachment of a child who has found a favored companion, attended school alongside him, and kept a proprietorial eye on him that William received with equanimity. The cooperative had, by 1889, proved itself. 3 seasons of consistent management, good records, and the water right stability that had been established in those first hard months had made the combined operation one of the more reliable in that part of the territory. They were not wealthy, none of them, but they were secure, which in the territory in the late 19th century was itself a kind of wealth. There was a morning in September of 1889, exactly 7 years after Edna had first ridden into Harrow Creek on Harriet, that she rode the south fence line at Calloway property, which was her habit on Tuesday mornings, with the autumn light coming in clean and strong and the first suggestion of cold in the air. She had left the children with Dolores and Jeremiah, who was working the near pasture with Tomas, and had waved her off with the look he gave her when he knew she needed the solitude of riding and would be better for it. She rode along the fence with the territory spread out around her, the red earth and the juniper and the high rock formations in the vast sky, and she thought about the 7 years and everything they contained, the water rights and the land office and the cattle drives and the drought and the good years, the dinner on the Rattlesnake Flats porch and the creek bank in August and the Soccer Row restaurant and the wedding in December, William's birth and Clara's birth and the ordinary, irreplaceable evenings by the fire, Dolores' coffee and Samuel Price's steady presence and Tomas's irrepressible goodwill, and Martha Thatcher's wisdom and Miss Marsh's chalk, and the way Harrow Creek had grown and changed around them without losing the essential quality that made it their place. She stopped Harriet at the highest point of the south fence line, where you could see the full sweep of the land, and she sat there in the morning and let herself feel the size of it all without moving away from it. The land was not gentle. It had never been gentle. It required everything of the people who lived on it, their full attention and their full capability and their willingness to work and adapt and persist. It gave back in proportion to what was brought to it, which was not a guarantee but was a kind of justice. She had brought everything she had to it, and it had given her back everything she had. She turned Harriet south and rode home. Jeremiah was at the corral gate when she returned, having finished with Tomas and come back to meet her, which was a habit he had developed without either of them remarking on it, and which she had come to understand as one of the quiet languages of their love. He took Harriet's reins while Edna dismounted and looked at her face with the attentive accuracy he had been applying to her for 7 years. "Good ride," he said. "Very good," she said. He unsaddled Harriet and led her to water, and Edna went inside to find Dolores and the children. Clara was in the kitchen with Dolores, both of them occupied with the making of biscuits in a collaboration that primarily involved Clara being covered in flour and extremely pleased about it. William was at the table with his slate, drawing something with an intensity that he did not look up from when Edna came in. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "The creek," he said. He held it up. It was, in fact, recognizably a creek, with 2 banks and small figures that she gathered were cattle. "And the cows," he added. "It is very good," she said. "I know," he said, with the serene confidence of 5, and went back to it. Dolores looked at Edna over Clara's flower-covered head and made a small, satisfied sound that contained within it a great deal of the history of the past several years, and its current, pleased conclusion. Jeremiah came in from the corral and washed his hands at the basin and accepted the cup of coffee Dolores placed in front of him with the gratitude of a man who knows exactly what he has and is not confused about its value. He sat at the table beside William and looked at the slate drawing and said, "Is that the creek?" "Yes," William said. "And the cows?" "The cows look very realistic," Jeremiah said. "I know," William said again. Edna sat down across from her husband and her son and looked at the scene in her kitchen, the flour and the coffee and the slate and the afternoon light coming in through the window, and she felt, as she had felt standing on the south fence line earlier that morning, the full and settled weight of a life that had turned out to be everything she had not known she was moving toward. The territory was not gentle. It had not asked her to be. She had walked into it with everything she had, her capability and her stubbornness and her loneliness and her love of the land and her capacity for something more than she had expected, and the land had offered her everything it had in return. A place. A man who looked at her and saw all of her without wanting to reduce any of it. A family built on honesty and work and the particular tenderness that does not require softness to be real. She was not a gentle woman. She had told him so, and he had told her that the frontier did not need gentle. He had been right, as he was often right about the things that mattered most. And she had been right, too, about herself, which was a different and equally important kind of knowing. She was exactly what she was, and what she was had been enough. More than enough. It had been the precise and necessary thing. The November of 1889 brought word through the papers that reached Harrow Creek that the territory had submitted another statehood petition to Congress, and the conversations in town about what statehood might mean were lively and various and would continue for years. Edna attended a town meeting on the subject and said her piece about land rights and water rights and the need for stronger protections for all the people who worked the land, not only the large operators but the smaller families and the individual claimants. Several people agreed with her. Several people disagreed. Heinrich Baer, who had been listening from his usual position at the back of the room, said afterward that her points were the most precisely stated of the evening, which she received as the high compliment he intended. Jeremiah, walking home with her after the meeting through the cold November night, said, "You should run for something when they make this a state." "I should not," she said, because the territory's laws about women's public roles were what they were, and she was practical about what was possible. "You would be better at it than most of the men who will," he said. "That is probably true," she said, without false modesty. "It is also not the point." He took her hand as they walked, and she let him, their fingers locked together in the cold air, and they walked back through the main street of Harrow Creek, with the saloon spilling warm light and music onto the street and the stars above in their permanent, indifferent abundance. Their lives continued to build, season by season, in the way that good lives do, not in grand gestures, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days made meaningful by the quality of attention and love brought to them. William started reading on his own with a ferocity that startled even Miss Marsh. Clara developed a deep fascination with horses that clearly came from her mother, and that Edna began to cultivate systematically when Clara was 4, setting her on the oldest, gentlest horse on the property, and walking alongside with her hand on the child's knee. Jeremiah watched this one afternoon from the porch railing with his coffee and the expression that he wore when something exceeded his usual capacity for composure. Edna, who noticed everything, looked over from beside the horse. "Stop watching me like that," she said. "You are going to make the horse nervous." "The horse is entirely calm," he said. "I am the one who is having trouble." "With what?" "With how lucky I am," he said. He said it simply, without drama, in the tone of a man making an accurate report, the same tone she used for the same kind of thing. She had given it to him, or he had given it to her, or they had found it together. She could not always tell where the boundaries were any more, which was perhaps the point. She looked at him for a moment with Clara's small hands in hers on the horse's mane and the afternoon light on everything, and said, "The feeling is mutual, Jeremiah, down to the very last inch of it." He raised his coffee cup to her across the yard, and she turned back to Clara, and the horse moved gently forward, and the day settled around all of them with the warmth of something fully arrived and fully known. The creek ran again that spring, as it always did, full and clear and necessary. Finding its way along the ancient channels, it had carved through the red earth toward the properties it sustained, dividing at the old stone marker as the documents required, feeding both sides with the impartial generosity of water that goes where it goes and asks nothing except that you do not stop it. Edna walked to the bank on the first morning of high water and stood at the edge and listened to it, the way she had done every spring since she arrived, and felt the same thing she always felt, which was a kind of gratitude too large for words, and therefore expressed in the simple act of standing at the bank and listening. Jeremiah came up beside her after a few minutes, having seen her go. He stood at her shoulder and looked at the water with the same quality of attention. "Good year," he said. "Good year," she agreed. They stood together at the bank of Redtail Creek in the spring of 1890, with their children playing behind them in the direction of the house and Dolor's voice audible from the kitchen and Tomas moving horses in the near pasture, and the whole living enterprise of their shared life, arranged around them like a landscape they had built together out of the hard and generous materials the frontier had provided, and they watched the water move, and they were home.